collapse doesn't always come with a loud noise. Sometimes it comes softly, silently, slowly, like a door closing behind you, and only then do you realize you've been locked inside. Emily Carter sat alone in a Manhattan courtroom that morning, and she knew that feeling well. The room was vast, with a high ceiling, cold fluorescent lights reflected off gray stone walls. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of old wood, legal paperwork, and an invisible pressure that exists only in places where human destinies are decided. Here, marriage was no longer a memory, no longer a promise. It had been reduced to a thick case file, a few numbers, and a ruling. Emily sat upright, both hands resting on the wooden table in front of her. She wore a light gray dress, so simple it nearly blended into the courtroom background. No jewelry, no designer handbag, not a single folder of documents before her. Just her, and the emptiness. At a glance, someone might think Emily was calm, but in truth, everything inside her was unraveling. Just weeks earlier, her life still had a familiar shape. A small apartment, a corner desk where she sketched fabric designs late into the night. Quiet mornings in which she believed that even if the marriage had grown cold, at least it still existed. Then it all disappeared. Her bank accounts were frozen without warning. Her credit card was declined at the checkout counter. People she once called friends suddenly became busy. Her phone went silent, messages went unanswered, and finally the court summons arrived. Emily lifted her gaze to the other side of the room. Mark Carter was sitting there, her husband, or rather the man who used to be her husband. Mark wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit, fitted down to every detail. A polished metal watch gleamed on his wrist, catching the light. Everything about him sent one clear message: control. He leaned back in his chair, carrying the relaxed posture of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. From time to time, Mark glanced at his watch, the corner of his mouth curling slightly, as if this hearing were nothing more than another appointment in his crowded schedule. Beside Mark sat his attorney, files neatly stacked, pen ready in hand. Everything was prepared. Everything except Emily. She had no lawyer sitting next to her. No one is leaning in to whisper instructions. No one was sliding a note across the table toward her. Only silence. The judge had not yet entered, but the room already felt like a verdict waiting to detonate. Emily heard whispers from the back rows. Eyes flicked toward her, quick, curious, then turned away. No one asked why a woman was sitting alone in a major divorce case. It was noted as unusual. Mark looked over at Emily, his gaze cold and sharp. There was no anger, no sadness, only the certainty of someone who believed he stood above her. He leaned toward his attorney and said something softly, meant only for the two of her. Them. The attorney nodded slightly. Mark smiled. It was the smile of a man who had already calculated every move. Emily knew exactly what he was thinking. He believed she had no way out. He believed freezing her accounts was the decisive blow. He believed she couldn't hire a lawyer, couldn't fight back, couldn't do anything except sit there and accept it. And perhaps, in Mark's eyes, Emily truly looked that way. A thin woman, powerless, without money, without a family standing behind her. Mark had said it to her many times before, during arguments that stretched past midnight. You have no one, Emily. Without me, what are you? Back then, Emily had stayed silent, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was too exhausted to explain. A side door in the courtroom opened. A court officer entered and asked everyone to stand. The judge was about to arrive. Emily rose by reflex, her legs slightly trembling. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her hands were ice cold, yet her palms were damp with sweat. This wasn't just a court hearing. This was the moment Mark wanted her to be seen as a failure. She knew it. And what frightened her most wasn't losing money, losing the house, or losing her reputation. It was the feeling of being looked down upon, of being turned into someone without a voice, right in front of strangers. The judge entered. Everyone sat. The hearing began. After a few preliminary procedures, a question was asked, one that sounded simple yet instantly changed the atmosphere of the room. Does the defendant have legal representation? Emily stood up. Her voice was quiet but clear. Your Honor, my attorney will be arriving. She said it without looking at Mark. But Mark laughed. He didn't cover his mouth. He didn't apologize. The sound of laughter cut through the silent room, sharp and piercing like a blade. A few people turned around. The judge frowned. Mark's attorney lightly placed a hand on his arm, but Mark didn't stop immediately. He leaned forward, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. Your Honor, I believe we all understand what's happening here. My wife cannot afford a lawyer. She doesn't understand the law, and frankly, she has nothing to dispute. The air froze. Emily felt blood rush to her ears. Her heart pounded so hard she thought someone else might hear it. But she said nothing. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't plead. She stood there, her hands clenched so tightly they turned white. Mark looked at her, satisfaction flickering in his eyes. In that moment, he believed he had achieved what he wanted most, placing her beneath him, right in front of justice itself. But Mark failed to notice one thing. Emily's silence was not surrender. It was the moment before the storm changed direction. And at the back of that courtroom, there was a door that had not yet opened. The courtroom did not grow noisy after Mark's statement. On the contrary, it sank into a heaviness so deep that one could clearly hear the rustle of turning pages, the faint scrape of chairs against the floor, and the slow rotation of the ceiling fan above. It was the kind of silence that existed not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone understood exactly what had just happened. Mark Carter had not merely spoken before the court. He had just redefined Emily's position, not as a wife, not as an equal individual, but as someone inferior, not worth waiting for. The judge looked at Mark, his gaze stern. Mr. Carter, he said slowly, this is a court of law. You will maintain the appropriate level of respect. Of course, Your Honor, Mark replied, his tone flawlessly polite. He stood, adjusted the button of his suit jacket, and wore the expression of a man doing the right thing. I simply wish to help the court save time. We've dragged this out long enough. Mark's attorney rose as well, perfectly on cue. The man carried a composed demeanor, his voice smooth, well accustomed to courtrooms where outcomes often favored the wealthy. Your Honor, he said, my client means no disrespect. However, we believe further delay is unnecessary. The defendant has had months to prepare, yet appears today without legal representation. Under procedure, the court is fully entitled to proceed. The words were delivered lightly, but each one carried weight. Emily heard every word, and she understood exactly what they were doing. This was not an impulsive moment. This was a script written in advance. Her accounts were not frozen to apply pressure. They were frozen to remove her from the game. Emily looked down at her hands. Her fingers were still trembling slightly, despite her effort to steady them. She remembered that morning clearly, the moment her bank card was declined at the grocery store. The cashier had apologized. The people waiting behind her had begun to sigh. She had smiled and said she'd forgotten her wallet. Then she walked outside, stood in the parking lot under the harsh sun, and realized for the first time she had been completely cut off. Mark knew that, and he used every second of it. "Emily," Mark said, turning toward her, his voice lowering as if speaking to a stubborn child, "I offered you a very fair settlement. You could have taken the money in the car and started over, but you refused." He shook his head, wearing an expression of feigned regret. "I don't understand why you insist on making everything so difficult." Emily lifted her eyes to him. There was no anger in her gaze, no pleading, only a quiet question. "Do you really believe what you're saying?" But she did not voice it. Mark's attorney continued, his tone flat as though reading from a report. "My client has provided complete financial documentation. Assets are clearly allocated in accordance with the prenuptial agreement. As for Mrs. Carter, she has no significant personal assets, no stable source of income, and, at present, no legal representation to contest these matters." A few people in the courtroom nodded slightly, not because they agreed, but because they were accustomed to this. Emily felt her throat tighten. She took a deep breath and stood. "Your Honor," she said, "I do not agree with how they are describing—" "Disagree?" Mark interrupted, this time faster, sharper. "Emily, you don't even understand what they're talking about. You never cared about money, about investments, about anything I built. You just—" He paused, as if choosing his words. "You were just there." The final word dropped into the room like a heavy object. Emily felt it strike her straight in the chest. Just there. No contribution, no value, existing only because of someone else. A burning sensation rose in her eyes, but Emily forced it down. She would not allow herself to cry here, not in front of him, not like this. She remembered the long nights alone in the apartment when Mark said he had to travel for work. She remembered the bills he told her not to worry about. The accounts he said were easier if I handle them. She had trusted him, not because she was naive, but because she chose to trust. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, calling for order. "Mrs. Carter," he said, turning to Emily, "the court needs to know. Will your attorney be present today?" Emily felt every gaze in the room converge on her. This was the moment Mark had been waiting for. She looked toward the back of the courtroom where the dark wooden door remained firmly closed. "Yes, Your Honor," Emily replied. Her voice was soft but steady. "My attorney will arrive." Mark laughed again, this time short and contemptuous. "Your Honor," he said, "we all know that isn't going to happen. She's simply trying to delay proceedings." He leaned toward Emily, speaking more quietly but clearly enough for the microphone to catch. "You have no one left, Emily. Don't embarrass yourself any further." In that moment, a choice became clearer to Emily than ever before. She could lower her head. She could ask for more time. She could let this story end exactly the way Mark wanted. But deep inside, something else was awakening. Not anger, but awareness. The awareness that her silence had been used as a weapon against her, that her trust had been transformed into proof of weakness, and that if she did not stand her ground today, she would carry this feeling for the rest of her life. Emily straightened. Her shoulders felt lighter. "Your Honor," she said, more clearly than before, "I understand this may appear as though I'm unprepared, but I am not avoiding this. I am here, and I will not leave." Mark looked at her, a flicker of irritation crossing his eyes, not fear, but surprise. He was not used to hearing Emily speak this way. Mark's attorney quickly intervened, requesting that proceedings continue. He emphasized that waiting was unnecessary and that the court could not rely on vague promises. The judge remained silent for several seconds, deep in thought. Mark felt his heartbeat slow. He was so close to the moment when the system itself would crush Emily. He did not see what Emily saw. The door at the back of the courtroom remained closed. But sometimes silence is not a sign of defeat. It is only the pause before everything turns. Time in the courtroom seemed to slow down. Not the kind of slow, lazy afternoon, but the kind that makes every second feel heavy when you know that with just one more decision, nothing will ever return to the way it was. The judge leaned forward to review the case file before him. Pages turned softly, producing a dry sound that echoed through the silent room. No one spoke. No one dared to move too abruptly. Emily stood there, her hands clasped together, her palms damp with sweat. She could feel her heartbeat clearly, each beat striking her chest as if to remind her, this is real, not a nightmare, not a family argument. This was the place where everything would be recorded in black ink on white paper. Across from her, Mark remained standing tall, his confidence entirely unshaken. He was used to moments like this. Boardrooms, negotiation tables, places where the person who spoke louder or carried thicker files usually won. Mark believed the courtroom was just another version of that. His attorney leaned in and whispered something quickly. Mark nodded slightly. He glanced at Emily, his gaze tinged with a trace of feigned patience and a faint irritation that was hard to miss. He wanted this to be over. He wanted to walk out of here with a complete victory. And more than anything, he wanted Emily to understand that resisting him was pointless. Your Honor, Mark's attorney spoke up, breaking the silence. We would like to reiterate our request. The defendant has failed to demonstrate the presence of legal representation. Continuing to wait is unreasonable. The voice was clear, measured, stripped of any excess emotion. It was the voice of someone accustomed to pushing opponents to the edge using entirely lawful language. Emily felt her throat go dry. She knew what was coming. She knew that if the judge nodded, she would have to stand alone against an entire system she had never been taught how to navigate. And Mark knew that even better than she did. Emily, Mark said, turning to her once more, his voice lowering, almost like advice. I don't want this to get ugly. You can end this right now. He paused as if offering her one final chance. All you have to do is agree to the settlement. Emily looked at him. In that moment, she realized something with sudden clarity. The man standing before her was no longer the man who once held her hand on quiet evenings, no longer the man who promised he would always stand by her side. He was a stranger, wearing a familiar face, but with eyes that were entirely different. She remembered the early years of their marriage, the times Mark said he had everything under control. When she asked about finances, he smiled and said, You don't need to worry about these things. Back then, she thought it was care. Now she understood it was exclusion. Emily turned toward the judge. Your Honor, she said, her voice gentle but more resolute than before. I am not refusing to cooperate. I am only asking for more time. Mark laughed, this time without hiding his contempt. Time for what? He asked. To wait for a miracle? A few people in the courtroom shifted in their seats. The air grew uncomfortable. Not because of legal tension, but because an invisible boundary was being crossed. The judge looked at Mark, his gaze sharpening. Mr. Carter, he said, the court has already reminded you to maintain appropriate conduct. My apologies, Your Honor, Mark replied quickly, his tone still polite. But when he turned back to Emily, the restraint was gone from his eyes. I'm just being realistic. Realistic. The word echoed in Emily's mind. The reality was that her accounts had been frozen overnight. The reality was that she couldn't afford to hire a lawyer even if she wanted to. The reality was that Mark had prepared everything. before she even understood what was happening. But there was another reality, one Mark did not see. Emily glanced toward the back of the courtroom. Once again. The door was still closed. Her heart sank for a brief moment. A part of her wondered whether she was deceiving herself, whether this waiting was a mistake, whether she was gambling her future on something uncertain. It was her weakest moment. If Mark had looked more closely, he might have seen it, but he didn't. He was too focused on the victory ahead. "Your Honor," Mark's attorney continued, "we request that proceedings move forward immediately. The defendant has had ample time and opportunity." The judge leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together. He looked at Emily for a long moment, not with judgment, but with the gaze of someone who had seen too many cases just like this. "Mrs. Carter," he said slowly, "the court requires clarity. If you do not have legal representation at this time, the court will be compelled to proceed." The words fell like a hammer. Emily took a deep breath. This was the moment when everything could end. She could say, I will represent myself." She could nod and step into an uneven fight, but deep inside another voice spoke up, a voice she had not heard in a long time. Her own. Emily straightened. Her shoulders no longer sagged as they had before. Her eyes no longer avoided anyone's gaze. "Your Honor," she said, each word deliberate, "I am not representing myself." The entire room froze. Mark frowned. His attorney stopped writing. "My attorney will be here," Emily continued, "and I believe that when she walks into this courtroom, the court will understand why I am not in a hurry." Mark stared at her, and for the first time something resembling confusion crossed his face. "She," he repeated. "Emily, who are you talking about?" Emily did not answer. She stood there, calm in a way that felt almost unnatural. The silence stretched on for a few more seconds, the longest seconds of her life. And then a minimal sound came from the back of the courtroom. Not a voice, not a cough, but the sound of metal touching wood. The sound of a door handle. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if taking a breath before stepping across an invisible threshold. Mark turned around. He did not know that in just a few more seconds, everything he believed to be reality was about to begin collapsing. The sound was minimal, just the faint touch of metal against wood. A soft click almost no one would notice, if they weren't holding their breath. But in the courtroom that morning, that sound rang out like an alarm. Emily heard it first. She didn't turn around right away, not out of fear, but because she needed a breath, a moment for her heart to catch up with what her mind had already known. The door at the back of the courtroom began to open. No one spoke. No one signaled. Yet every pair of eyes in the room, as if pulled by an invisible force, turned in the same direction. Mark turned his head, irritation flickering across his face. He assumed it was just a court clerk who had entered the wrong room, or a late attorney, an insignificant interruption, not enough to change anything. But as the door opened wider, the expression on Mark's face began to change. The woman who entered was not in a hurry. She wore a pristine white suit, minimal, sharp, and so precisely tailored that every cut radiated absolute control. Her silver hair was neatly trimmed, not a strand out of place. Her steps were steady, firm, and so composed that others wondered. She was not worried at all. 3 younger people followed behind her, each carrying a thick briefcase, walking in perfect sync without saying a word. They didn't need to speak. Their presence said everything. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow. The woman stopped in the middle of the aisle. She removed her sunglasses, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes were revealed, cold, sharp, and terrifyingly calm. No curiosity, no hesitation, only the certainty of someone who knew exactly where she was and why she had come. Mark's attorney froze. The pen slipped from his fingers and struck the wooden table with a dry clack. The color drained visibly from his usually composed face. Mark noticed. He turned toward his attorney, frowning. "What's going on?" Mark asked quietly, impatience creeping into his voice. The attorney didn't answer right away. He only whispered, very softly, as if he didn't believe it himself. "That's impossible." Mark turned back to look at the woman again. This time he looked more closely. That suit was not something one wore to show up. That bearing was not of someone begging the court for more time. And most importantly, that gaze was not the gaze of someone entering a courtroom at a disadvantage. The woman began to walk forward. Each step echoed clearly against the stone floor like a measured strike against the confidence Mark had built since the beginning of the hearing. As she passed the public benches, a few people instinctively sat up straighter. Someone else swallowed hard. She stopped in front of Emily's table. Emily turned. The moment their eyes met, everything around them seemed to disappear. There was no greeting, no embrace, just a slight nod. But within that nod lived an entire history. Years of distance, difficult choices, unspoken misunderstandings. And one thing that had never changed? Protection. The woman turned to the judge. "I apologize for my late arrival, Your Honor. I was finalizing the submission of additional documents regarding the plaintiff's financial situation." The judge narrowed his eyes. "Please state your identity," he said. Apologizing, I placed a gold-embossed Bonner on the clerk's desk. "Victoria Hale," she said, "attorney for the defendant." A brief pause. Then she continued, her voice dropping just a fraction. "And I am her mother." The air was sucked out of the courtroom. Mark stood frozen. "Mother?" he repeated, as if the word didn't belong to any language he knew. "That's impossible. Emily told me that—" Emily looked straight at him. "I said my mother was no longer part of my life," she said slowly. "I never said she didn't exist." Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His attorney bent over the files, frantically flipping through pages as if searching for an escape route. But the words on the paper were no longer on his side. Victoria placed a large briefcase on the table. When she opened it, the metallic click of the latch sounded sharp and cold. Inside were stacks of documents, neatly organized, clearly categorized, so thick that merely looking at them made one's chest feel heavy. "My daughter," Victoria said, still not looking at Emily, but directly at Mark, "left this family years ago because she wanted to live an ordinary life. She did not want my surname. She did not want privilege. She did not want the protection that came with a reputation." She paused. She wanted to be loved for who she was. Emily lowered her head, her throat tightened. "But," Victoria continued, her voice turning colder, "choosing silence does not mean surrendering the right to be protected." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, before these proceedings continue, I wish to inform the court that my client, Ms. Emily Carter, now has legal representation. Any prior statements claiming she had no one or could not afford representation are no longer valid." Mark's attorney sprang to his feet. "Objection!" he said, his voice higher than before. "Arriving late and introducing new documents in the middle of proceedings." Victoria turned to look at him. Just one look. No sarcasm, no threat. But he stopped mid-sentence. "We will discuss procedure," Victoria said calmly, "after the court has reviewed the full evidence regarding the accounts your client failed to disclose." Mark stepped back. "What accounts?" he asked, his voice beginning to unravel. Victoria pulled out a stack of papers and raised it just high enough. An account in the Cayman Islands, a cryptocurrency wallet held in a bank vault, and a shell company used to transfer marital assets. She looked directly at Mark. I believe you know exactly what we're talking about. Mark felt his throat go dry. Cold sweat began to form at the back of his neck. He turned to his attorney, searching for reassurance, but the man would not meet his eyes. For the first time since the hearing began, Mark realized a simple and horrifying truth. He was no longer the one in control of this room. Emily stood there, quietly observing. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a strange sensation, as if a weight that had pressed on her shoulders for years was finally beginning to shift. The door had opened, and from this moment on, nothing would follow Mark's plan anymore. There is a particular moment in every confrontation. It is not when voices are raised, not when accusations are spoken aloud, but the moment when the person who believed they controlled everything begins to realize there are truths that no longer obey them. That moment was unfolding in a Manhattan courtroom. Victoria Hale stood upright behind Emily's table, both hands resting lightly on the wooden surface. She was in no hurry. She showed no sign of triumph. She resembled a physician reading diagnostic results, fully aware of every number, every indicator, and knowing there was no need to raise her voice to be heard. The judge looked through the documents she had just submitted, turning page after page. His expression revealed little, but his brows tightened slightly. Ms. Hale, he said, these documents were not included in the original filing. That is correct, Your Honor, Victoria replied. Because they were not disclosed. A short sentence, but it landed with weight. Mark's attorney jumped to his feet again. Objection, he said, this time unable to conceal his tension. These allegations have not been verified, introducing them in the middle of proceedings. Victoria turned to him slowly. Are you concerned about procedure, she asked, or are you concerned that what's in them is true? The attorney froze. In that instant, he realized he was facing someone who did not play by familiar rules. This was not the type of lawyer who created smokescreens, dragged out time, or hid behind technicalities. Victoria had not come to argue. She had come to point out what had already happened. Your Honor, Victoria continued, turning back to the judge, my client has been described as having no assets, making no contribution, and not understanding finances. I request permission to clarify. She removed another folder and placed it neatly on the table. Throughout 8 years of marriage, all income earned by Ms. Emily Carter, whether from freelance design work, selling handmade products, or small individual contracts, was deposited into a joint account. This account, according to Mr. Mark Carter, was managed by him for convenience. Victoria paused and looked directly at Mark. But, she said, over the past 4 years, funds from that account were gradually transferred into a limited liability company that was not registered as marital property. Mark shook his head. That's my personal company, he said quickly, as if the answer were rehearsed. It was established before we were married. Victoria nodded slightly. That is correct, she said. And for that very reason, using marital assets to sustain it without your wife's consent is an issue. The room began to stir. Emily stood still, her heart pounding. She listened to every sentence, every word, as if hearing her own life retold from an entirely different perspective. Decisions she had believed were not necessary to question. Documents she had signed without reading carefully, out of trust. All of it was now emerging under the light of truth. Victoria continued. And there is more, she said, her voice still even. In the financial affidavit submitted to this court 3 days ago, Mr. Mark Carter stated that his total personal assets did not exceed the declared amount. She turned another page. However, according to statements from a financial institution in the Cayman Islands, there were at least 3 large transfers made over the past 18 months, each coinciding with the periods during which Mr. Carter claimed his income had declined. Mark stood abruptly. "That proves nothing," he said loudly. "That's investment money, my money!" The judge raised a hand, signaling for order. Victoria did not turn to Mark immediately. She looked straight at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "what makes these transactions noteworthy is not merely the amount, but the fact that they were omitted from a sworn declaration." Only then did she turn to Mark. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone softer by a single degree but more dangerous. "Do you recall what you signed at the end of that affidavit?" Mark swallowed hard. I'll remind you," Victoria said. "You signed affirming that all information provided was complete and truthful, under penalty of law." No one spoke. Mark's attorney lowered his head toward the table, flipping through files repeatedly as if searching for an escape among words that had lost all meaning. Emily looked at Mark. For the first time that day, she no longer saw him as larger than herself, no longer saw him as the one holding power. He looked smaller. "Your Honor," Victoria continued, "I have not yet addressed the prenuptial agreement." Mark snapped his head up. "She signed it!" he shouted. "She signed willingly!" Victoria removed a thin envelope. "You are correct," she said. "There is a signature." She placed the envelope down, opened it, and withdrew another set of documents. "But a signature only holds value when it is given freely." She looked directly at Mark. "Do you remember the night before the wedding, Mr. Carter?" Mark remained silent. "The night you said that if Emily didn't sign, you would call off the wedding? The night you threatened to cut off all financial support? The night you described the consequences in concrete terms?" Emily felt her legs weaken. She had never shared those details with anyone except one person, Victoria. "These are messages from that night," Victoria said, holding up printed pages, "recovered from a phone backup." Mark's attorney glanced at them, his expression changing visibly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice no longer the same, "we need time to review." "That request will be considered later," the judge said, his tone more severe than before. "Proceed." Mark scanned the courtroom, searching for a sympathetic glance. There was none. Emily felt tears rise, but this time not from fear, from relief. She had not imagined what she had lived through. She had not been weak for remaining silent. The truth was standing on her behalf. Victoria closed the folder as if concluding a chapter. "Your Honor," she said, "we will continue presenting details regarding concealed assets and the misuse of marital property for personal purposes. But I believe that at this point, the court has sufficient grounds to understand one thing. This hearing is not about a woman who was unprepared." She turned to Emily and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It is about a woman whose voice was taken away, and who is now taking it back." The courtroom fell silent. No one doubted that from this moment on, the story had moved beyond the boundaries of an ordinary divorce case. And Mark Carter, though not yet convicted, came to understand one truth, far too late. There are truths that once named will never return to the shadows. There are truths that, when exposed through documents, make people uneasy. But there are other truths, when spoken aloud by a human being, that leave an entire room unable to breathe. Victoria Hale stood still for a moment after closing the folder. She said nothing more. She pressed nothing. There was nothing left she needed to do. The silence stretched on long enough for the focus in the courtroom to shift, no longer on the paperwork, no longer on the numbers, but toward Mark Carter. Mark stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightened. On a face that had always been carefully controlled, a thin crack began to appear. He hadn't lost yet. At least that was what he told himself. Documents could be argued, numbers could be explained. His lawyer was still there. But what Mark failed to realize was this: once the truth is named, it has a way of summoning witnesses no one invited, and no one can stop. Victoria turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "before we proceed with further financial analysis, I request permission to call the next witness." Mark's attorney snapped his head up. "A witness?" he asked, more urgently than usual. "Which witness?" Victoria did not answer him. She looked directly at the judge. "This witness," she said, "is directly related to the use of marital assets as well as the plaintiff's motives and conduct throughout the marriage." The judge glanced down at the list in front of him, then nodded. "Call the witness," he said. Mark felt his heartbeat slip out of rhythm. He turned to his attorney and lowered his voice. "What is this?" he whispered. "What is she trying to pull now?" The attorney did not answer immediately. He stared toward the courtroom door as if he had begun to sense something but refused to believe it. Victoria turned toward the door. "I call Sarah Miller." The name was not loud, but it was enough. Mark froze. The color drained from his face so quickly that it was almost visible. His eyes widened, then narrowed, as if trying to determine whether he had heard correctly. "No," he muttered. "That's impossible." The door at the back of the courtroom opened again. A young woman stepped inside. She wore a simple dark blue dress, no heavy makeup. Her hair was neatly tied back. Her steps were slow, slightly hesitant, not from lack of resolve, but from the knowledge that she was entering a place where she would not be welcomed. Her eyes swept across the room and stopped on Mark. For a brief moment, Mark saw something in her gaze, not affection, not resentment, clarity. Sarah passed Mark without looking at him again. Mark lifted his hand instinctively as if to call her back, but his arm froze mid-air, then fell. She took the witness stand. The oath was administered quickly. Sarah's voice trembled slightly as she swore to tell the truth, not because she feared Mark, but because she knew that from this moment on, nothing could be undone. Victoria stepped forward, her tone softer as she addressed Sarah. "Thank you for being here today," she said. "I know this isn't easy." Sarah gave a slight nod. "Could you tell the court," Victoria asked, "what your relationship with Mr. Mark Carter was?" The entire room held its breath. Sarah inhaled deeply. "We had a personal relationship," she said. "It lasted nearly 2 years." A murmur rippled through the public benches. The judge tapped the gavel lightly, calling for order. Mark lowered his head, his shoulders stiffening. Victoria continued. "During that time," she asked, "did Mr. Carter ever speak to you about his wife?" Sarah hesitated for a second. She glanced at Emily. Emily stood there silently. No pleading, no threats, just listening. Sarah turned back to Victoria. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steadier now. "Many times." "What did he say?" Sarah swallowed. "He said..." Emily didn't understand that she was a burden, that she didn't deserve what he had. Emily closed her eyes, not because it hurt, but because she had heard those words before. This time, they were no longer spoken in the dark. "Did Mr. Carter ever talk to you about this divorce?" Victoria continued. Sarah nodded. "Yes," she said. "He was very confident." "What did he say?" Sarah paused, her hands tightened together. "He said He would leave his wife with nothing, not because he needed the money, but because he wanted to. The room seemed to freeze. Mark snapped his head up. "You're making this up," he shouted. "You're lying!" The judge struck the gavel hard. "Mr. Carter, silence!" Victoria did not turn around. "Could you explain further?" she asked, her voice still calm. Sarah looked directly at Mark for the first time. He said he wanted to teach Emily a lesson, that she needed to know who was really in control. He laughed when he said it. Emily felt her chest tighten. An old pain surfaced, but this time it was no longer strong enough to pull her under. Victoria nodded slightly. "During the time you were together," she asked, "did Mr. Carter use marital funds for this relationship?" Sarah did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Rent, furniture, gifts. He paid for everything." "Did he ever say where that money came from?" "He said it was his money," Sarah replied, "that his wife didn't need to know." Mark slammed his hand on the table. "That's enough," he shouted. "None of this has anything to do with assets." The judge stared at him, his gaze turning cold. "It does," he said, "when marital funds are used for personal purposes during a marriage." Mark stepped back as if struck. Victoria stepped aside, giving the room to Sarah. "Is there anything else," she asked, "that you believe the court should know?" Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice low but clear. "He once said that Emily would never dare to fight back, that she was too gentle, too quiet." Sarah paused and looked at Emily. He was wrong. A simple sentence, but it cut like a final blade. Victoria nodded. "No further questions," she said. Mark's attorney rose slowly. He looked at Sarah, then at Mark, who avoided his gaze. No questions," he said quietly. The judge leaned back in his chair, removed his glasses, and released a long breath. Emily stood there, her heart still pounding. But for the first time, she no longer felt small in this room. The truth had been spoken, and Mark Carter, the man who once believed he controlled everything, was beginning to realize that no power is excellent enough to silence a witness who has chosen to tell the truth. There are moments in life when you don't hear thunder, yet you still know the storm has arrived. The courtroom sank into a different kind of silence than before. No longer the silence of waiting, but the silence of realization. Sarah Miller's words still hung in the air like a thin haze that refused to dissipate. No one rushed to speak next. No one wanted to break that moment. Mark Carter stood there, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. The carefully tailored suit suddenly looked oversized, as if he had shrunk in the span of a few minutes. Sweat soaked the collar of his shirt, even though the temperature in the room had not changed. Mark's attorney sat down very slowly, setting his pen aside. He no longer flipped through files, no longer took notes. He stared at the surface of the table like a man who had realized the battle had moved far beyond his control. The judge removed his glasses and placed them on the desk. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, a small gesture that said a great deal. This was not the ordinary fatigue of a long workday. It was the weight of someone who had just seen the true nature of another human being. He looked up, his gaze slowly sweeping across the room. "This case," the judge said, his voice deep and steady, "was initially presented as a contested divorce involving the division of assets." He paused. "But what this court has heard today goes far beyond that scope." Emily stood still, her hands resting lightly in front of her. She did not dare breathe too deeply, not out of fear, but because she felt something fragile forming, like a bridge being laid after years of separation by a deep chasm. The judge turned to Mark. "Mr. Carter," he said, "you testified under oath that you did not conceal assets, did not use marital funds for personal purposes, and did not exert pressure on your wife to sign any agreement." Mark opened his mouth. "You will speak when asked," the judge cut in, his voice not loud but firm. The room fell utterly silent. "The evidence just presented," the judge continued, "together with witness testimony indicates a consistent pattern of behavior." He turned a page. "Concealment of assets, use of marital funds for personal purposes, and the deliberate placement of a spouse at a financial disadvantage." Emily felt her throat tighten. Those words. She had lived with them for years, but had never heard them named so clearly. The judge turned to Victoria Hale. "Ms. Hale," he said, "the court acknowledges the thorough preparation and seriousness of the materials you have provided." Victoria nodded slightly. She did not smile. She did not appear victorious. She understood this was not a moment for personal emotion. "Your Honor," she said, "the most important thing for my client is not punishment. It is to be seen fairly." The judge nodded. "And that is exactly what the court will do." He sat up straight and placed both hands on the desk, the posture of someone about to make a decision, not impulsively, but as the result of years of experience and responsibility. Before issuing a final ruling, the judge said, "The court will issue interim orders, effective immediately." Mark snapped his head up. Emily felt her heart beat faster. "First," the judge said, "the court orders the immediate freezing of all assets, bank accounts, investments, and legal entities directly or indirectly connected to Mr. Mark Carter." A murmur spread through the room. Mark shook his head as if unable to believe what he was hearing. "The only access," the judge continued, "shall be granted to Ms. Emily Carter and her legal team." Emily closed her eyes for a very brief moment, not out of triumph, but out of relief. "Second," the judge said, "Ms. Emily Carter is granted exclusive residence in the current marital home. Mr. Mark Carter is to vacate the premises within 24 hours. Mark let out a short, hollow laugh. "Your Honor, if you remove any property beyond personal belongings," the judge interrupted, "the court will consider it a violation of this order." Mark fell silent. His attorney lowered his head even further. "Third," the judge said, his voice turning colder, "the court finds clear indications of perjury and financial fraud." He looked directly at Mark. "The record from today's proceedings will be forwarded to federal authorities for further review." Emily heard a very quiet intake of breath from somewhere behind her, someone in the public gallery. Mark stood motionless as if the ground beneath his feet had vanished. The judge turned to Mark's attorney. "Mr. Ross," he said, "the court advises full cooperation with the investigating authorities." The attorney nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Honor." "And finally," the judge said, his gaze softening slightly as it moved to Emily, "regarding legal fees." He paused, long enough for everyone to understand what was coming. "Mr. Mark Carter shall be responsible for the full payment of Ms. Emily Carter's legal expenses, including all costs arising from financial investigations." Victoria took a quiet breath. Emily felt her legs weaken. She lightly gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. The judge struck the gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." The sound of the gavel echoed, not loud but decisive, like a door closing. People began to move, chairs shifted, whispers returned, but for Emily it all felt distant, pushed far away. She stood there, unsure what to do with her emotions. Mark turned toward her. There was no longer contempt, no confidence, only the disorientation of a man who had just lost what he believed was untouchable. "Emily," he said, his voice hoarse. "We can talk." Emily looked at him. For the first time in a long while, she felt no need to explain, to soothe, or to preserve anything at all. "Not now," she said softly. Not a rejection, but a conclusion. Victoria stepped beside her and placed a hand on her back, a small gesture, but steady. "Let's go," she said. Emily nodded. As mother and daughter turned and walked out of the courtroom, Emily did not look back. Not out of bitterness, but because she understood that some chapters in life do not need to be reread. Behind them, Mark Carter remained standing in the room that had once belonged to him. For the first time, he understood a truth that no amount of money or power could deny. Justice does not need to rush, but when it speaks, it always knows exactly who must pay the price. Not all endings are loud. Some unfold in silence. When the courtroom door has closed, when the judge's gavel no longer echoes in your ears, and a person is forced to face themselves without an audience. Emily stepped onto the stone steps of the Manhattan courthouse that afternoon. Sunlight poured into the plaza, bright enough to make her squint. The first feeling was not victory, nor was it joy. It was emptiness. As if she had finally set down a heavy backpack she had carried for too long, lighter now but not yet accustomed to the lightness. Beside her, Victoria Hale stood tall, watching the flow of people as though it were an ordinary afternoon. But Emily noticed her mother's hands trembling slightly. Not much, just enough that only someone standing very close would see it. "Are you okay?" Victoria asked. Emily nodded but didn't answer right away. She needed a few seconds to find the honest response. "I'm learning how to breathe again," she said softly. Victoria smiled, very faintly. Not the smile of a lawyer who had won a case, but the smile of a mother who had kept her child standing through a storm. They walked down the steps. No reporters, no applause. Just the city continuing to move, yellow taxis, honking horns, strangers who had no idea that for Emily, the axis of the world had just shifted. Behind them, Mark Carter remained in the courthouse lobby. He didn't follow. He didn't call out. He didn't know what to do with his hands. Only hours earlier he had believed his power was self-evident, that money, preparation, and confidence could buy any outcome. Now none of those things vanished instantly, but the belief had shattered. Mark's attorney walked past him, offered a brief nod, and kept going, phone already pressed to his ear. No reassurances, no strategies, only calls that needed to be made to protect himself. Mark watched him go, then turned toward the large glass doors where his own reflection stared back. The man still in a suit, still standing upright, but with empty eyes. And he understood something at last. When the system you rely on turns its back, loneliness arrives very quickly. The days that followed passed more slowly than Emily had expected. There was no single moment where everything was suddenly fine. No neat cut like in a movie. Just mornings that began with a strange sensation that she was no longer being monitored, no longer weighing every word, every small expense. Her accounts were reopened. The numbers inside stunned her, but they also revealed something else. Money doesn't heal anything by itself. Healing came from more minor things. She makes her own coffee in the morning without asking anyone. From buying a new sketchbook and revisiting ideas she had abandoned. From opening the apartment window and letting the wind rush in without permission. Victoria stayed in the city for a while longer. Not to oversee the case, everything was now moving through the legal system, but to remain close to her daughter. They didn't talk much about the past. They didn't need to. Some fractures, once acknowledged, don't require further dissection. One evening, as Emily reorganized her old workspace, she found a stack of yellowed sketches. Awkward lines, but full of feeling. She picked them up and stared for a long time. "I used to think I didn't have time for this," Emily said. "You thought you didn't have the right to it," Victoria corrected gently. Emily looked up. For the first time, she didn't argue. Elsewhere in the city, Mark was learning a different lesson, the lesson of consequences. Frozen accounts, unreturned calls, emails written in cold, legal language, questions from investigators he could no longer avoid. The spacious apartment began to feel cramped. The silence there wasn't peaceful, it was hollow. Mark realized he had built his life on control, and when that was taken away, he no longer knew who he was. He remembered the moment Emily said, "Not now." At the time, he thought it was a tactic. Now, he understood it was a boundary. For Emily, rebirth didn't arrive as a leap, but as a steady current. She began accepting small orders for textile designs. No loud promotion, no rush, just working with the honesty she had forgotten she possessed. A small gallery in Brooklyn offered to include her in a group exhibition. Emily hesitated. Then she agreed. On opening day, she stood in the white room looking at her work on the walls. There was no thunderous applause, just people who stopped and looked a little longer. One woman approached her and said quietly, "I don't know why, but this piece makes me feel understood." Emily smiled. This time, the smile reached her eyes. Victoria stood in the corner, not intruding. She watched her daughter as if observing something newly sprouted. No need to push, only to protect. One afternoon, as they sat by the window watching the city lights gradually come on, Emily asked, "Do you regret it? Letting me walk my own path?" Victoria thought for a long time. "There are fears," she said slowly, "that only disappear once you walk through them. If I had kept you close, you would have been safe, but you wouldn't have been free." Emily nodded. She understood. Freedom doesn't come from being rescued. Freedom comes from standing back up after you've fallen. Emily's story didn't end in the courtroom. It continued every day in small choices. She learned to say no without apologizing. She learned to say yes to herself. She learned to trust that her silence was not weakness, it was simply the place where she listened. And somewhere else, Mark was living with the consequences of his choices, not as a moral lesson, but as an irreversible reality. Life isn't fair in a simple way, but it is precise. It remembers. It waits. And when the time comes, it returns everything to its rightful place. Emily stood by the window, looking out at the city at night. Lights reflected in her eyes, no fear, no avoidance. Only one clear feeling remained. She had come back to herself. Some stories do not end when the lights go out. They remain in an unanswered question, in a breath that slows more than usual, in the quiet realization that you once stood very close to a boundary. Emily no longer walked with fear hanging from her shoulders, but she also didn't wake each morning with a sense of victory. What she had, after everything, was a new kind of calm. Not empty, not heavy, just enough to listen to herself. One evening, Emily turned off the lights earlier than usual. She sat by the window, looking at the scattered squares of light in the buildings across the street. Each lit window was a story. Each story might resemble hers, or might not. She wondered, how many people in those rooms were silent because they chose to be, and how many were quiet because they were not allowed to speak? There was no clear answer to that question, but it helped Emily understand why her story, though quiet, could still resonate with others. Because silence, in the end, is not a single state. There is the silence of peace, and there is the silence of deprivation. Only when we can distinguish between the two do we truly understand where we stand. Victoria did not stay in New York long. She had her own work, other cases, other courtrooms. But before leaving, she and Emily took a walk around the neighborhood. They did not talk about the court. They did not mention Mark. They did not bring up the thick files that had once sat on a cold wooden table. They talked about small things, about the smell of morning coffee, about an upcoming art exhibition, about whether they should plant more greenery in the apartment. These were conversations Emily once thought were unimportant. Now she understood. It was precisely these small things that created the feeling of being alive. Before getting into the car for the airport, Victoria took her daughter's hand. "You don't have to be strong every day," she said. "You just have to be honest." Emily nodded. It wasn't a promise. It was a choice. Mark's story was not told much after that, not because it lacked significance, but because it became familiar in a sad way. Meetings with lawyers, sleepless nights, moments of looking into the mirror and no longer recognizing the person he once believed was strong. Mark did not become a different person after a single court hearing. There was no romantic awakening, only a prolonged confrontation with consequences, with memories, with words he had once spoken and never expected to hear again. Perhaps the hardest lesson is not losing what you have, but understanding why you misused it. For Emily, the most visible change did not lie in the numbers in her accounts or in gallery openings. It lay within boundaries. She learned to set boundaries without over-explaining, to leave conversations that made her shrink, to stop calling endurance a virtue. Once, in an intimate conversation, someone asked her, "What changed you?" Emily thought for a long time. "Not the court," she said, "not my mother, but the moment I realized I had been silent for far too long about things that didn't deserve it." The other person nodded. They didn't ask more. Because some things can only be understood by those who have lived them. What makes this story linger is not the fall of a powerful man, nor the striking entrance of a formidable mother. It is the moment a woman realizes her voice is still there, simply waiting to be used at the right time. Not everyone has a courtroom to walk into. Not everyone has a door that opens at the perfect moment. But everyone has tiny moments when they can choose to speak or remain silent. This story does not say that silence is wrong. It only reminds us that silence should be a choice, not a destiny. There is a quote Emily loves, though she no longer remembers where she read it. "You don't need to shout to prove you exist, but you do need to speak to protect what matters." She thinks about the years she confused the two. About how she once believed love meant yielding, that peace meant enduring. Now she understands. True peace does not make you disappear. True love does not make you smaller. When this story is retold, someone may see themselves in Emily, or in Mark, or in a very different character, a bystander who watched, unsure of what to do. That doesn't matter. What matters is that when the story ends, the listener doesn't rush to stand up. They linger for one more beat. They think about a conversation that hasn't happened yet, a boundary that hasn't been drawn, a sentence swallowed for far too long. And maybe, just maybe, they will do something small, but different. Speak one sentence, refuse one thing, or acknowledge that their feelings are real. Emily's story does not close with a period. It opens with a pause for each person to ask themselves, if I walked into a room like that today, where would I stand? And when the door opens, whether a real door or merely a moment of awareness, will I choose to remain silent or step forward? The answer, like all essential answers, does not live in this story. It lives in the life of the one who is listening. Some stories don't need a final explosion to end. They end in a very different kind of silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of someone who has walked through the storm and is now standing still, looking up at the sky. Emily stood by the window of her apartment late one evening. The city below was as loud as ever. Traffic, lights, lives rushing past one another, intersecting and then pulling away. No one knew that for her, the world had changed. Not because she won, but because she was no longer losing herself. She remembered the first day she walked into the courtroom, the gray dress, the cold hands, the feeling of being shrunken by other people's eyes. Back then, she had thought, maybe I really am as weak as they say. But now, standing here, no courtroom lights, no sound of a gavel, she understood something very few people realize in time. Weakness is not silence. A weakness is believing you don't deserve to speak. And she had thought that for many years. Somewhere else, Mark Carter was also living in his own silence. No longer the silence of power, no longer the silence of someone controlling the game, but the silence of a man with no one left to dominate. No one yelled at him. No one mocked him the way he once mocked others. Only empty rooms, long nights, and questions he couldn't push away. Where did I go wrong? And why did I believe love meant control? Not everyone finds the answers, but everyone has to live with the questions, in their own way. As for Victoria Hale, the mother, she did not see herself as the hero of this story. She didn't speak much about the trial, didn't retell the victory, didn't mention reputation or career. She said only one thing to her daughter before leaving the city. I didn't come to save you. I came to make sure you weren't crushed before you could stand up on your own. There are kinds of love like that. Not loud, not seeking the spotlight, but always arriving at the right moment so that no one is annihilated. If you're still listening, you might be thinking, this is a big story, a courtroom, a powerful mother. But Deep Life Tales is never told stories to make people admire the characters. We tell them because there's something deeply human inside them. Because not all of us have a courtroom. Not all of us have a great lawyer. Not all of us have a door that opens at the perfect moment. But many of us have, at some point, stayed silent to keep the peace. Given that so many things wouldn't get worse, made ourselves smaller out of fear of being seen as difficult. Endured because we thought it was the only way to be loved. And many of us have been underestimated simply because we didn't speak up. Emily's story doesn't say you must always fight back. It doesn't say silence is wrong. It reminds us of one crucial thing. Silence only has value when you choose it, not when it's forced upon you. The moment Emily stood in the courtroom and said, I am not representing myself. That wasn't pride. It was the moment she acknowledged that she deserved protection. Nothing more, nothing less. Maybe somewhere you're standing in a different kind of courtroom. A relationship, a job, a family, or simply a conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe you're silent not because you have nothing to say, but because you're not sure your voice will be heard. If so, this story isn't telling you what to do. It just wants to sit beside you for a moment and whisper, you don't need to shout to prove your worth, but you shouldn't disappear to make others comfortable. When this video ends, you can keep scrolling. you can move on to another story. You can forget Emily, forget Mark. But if something stays with you, a feeling, a thought, a slower heartbeat, that's precisely why Deep Life Tales exists. We don't tell stories to put you on one side or another. We tell them so you can look back at yourself. If this story reminded you of a moment in your own life, leave a comment. You don't have to tell everything. One line is enough. If you think someone else needs to hear this story, please share it with them. Not to teach them a lesson, but to let them know they're not alone in their silence. And if you want to keep walking with stories that are slow, deep, and real, subscribe to Deep Life Tales. We'll meet again in stories that aren't loud, but stay with you for a long time. Because sometimes, the strongest thing you can do isn't defeating someone else. It's refusing to disappear.